Hello everyone, and welcome to another Infinity the Game Battle Report. Today we have Tohaa vs Bakunin, played in a slightly variant version of the Armory. Now this is just literally kitchen table Infinity, but a number of interesting things happened during this game, and I managed to get a couple of snaps during the course of it, so I thought I'd run it up as a report. To start with, this game was played using a Tohaa list I've been working on for a little bit now, and which I was thinking of taking to CanCon but didn't quite make the cut. Basically, it wasn't quite ready in time, and it wasn't fit as part of a pairing for the scenarios at hand. But I've played it a couple of times before, a few times since, and I've really quite enjoyed it. So this is it on screen now. Now, one of the first things to note about this list, it is completely absent any of the Tohaa impersonators, or even much midfield at all. It has the Libertos, which is a really good piece that you should have in most vanilla lists. But in particular, it's absent Jan Star. Now, Jan Star is a really strong Tohaa piece. There's a powerful combination where you take Jan Star, you reserve deploy them alongside a Kael'thas specialist, allowing you to impersonate Jan Star up to or into the enemy deployment zone, and then place a Symbiote and a Symbio Bomb on them. But not to put too fine a point on it, I am crap with Jan Star. I'm not sure why that is. I think there's a number of factors at play that cause me to have bad results. I have muscle memory for days that really does not apply to Jan Star. He functions quite differently. The 2 wounds but lower close combat stats change how he works, as does access to a Symbiote and a Symbio Bomb. But also, where I play and locally, not only do I play Assassins and Hack Islam, but so do other people. We have a very competent Spiral Core player who uses a Grief regularly. We also have other combined army players, including one that plays like middleweight combined army with lots of the cream of the crop 30-point pieces, including a Speculo. So there is a lot of impersonation play in my local town, which means that people are really, really good at dealing with impersonators. It's increasingly rare that there's an easy gap you can exploit with an impersonator in enemy deployment zones, which means that, for example, how I use for days, I roll to impersonate just to try and force that breach much more often than I would in, say, playing on TTS or even just, 2 years ago. For Jan Star, this is really bad because his impersonation score, his whip, is only 13, whereas for days rolling on 15, Speculo's on 14s, and he lacks the disposability of a Greif operator that makes gambling that whip 13 roll kind of palatable. And so you have to play him differently. You really have to use his full tool set. The fact that he has a shotgun and 2 wounds and can be given a Symbiote to force those breaches, and it just does not seem to happen for me. So I have been attempting to write lists that run without Jan Star, that don't use him or rely on him, and leverage some other Tohaa strengths. And in particular, there are 2 Taquiel officers in this list. That's not going to be a surprise to anyone that is familiar with Tohaa, but for those who are not, Taquiel officers are one of the big, powerful new pieces that arrived with N4 when they finally gave Ferroware 2 units, not just containing it 2 Symbio Bombs. So that rule, Ferroware, which technically we did see on, we saw a Razor on Kriegel agents in N3 with Spiral, but we never saw, for example, Endgame, and we can see that now. So Taquiel officers they're very special because they have zone of control ballistic skill attacks in the form of Ferroware that can do damage with Endgame or create eclipse zones with Mirror Ball. And both of those you're going to see very heavily utilized in this game. In addition, they're just kind of okay troops. Armor 3, BTS 6, 2 wounds, regeneration. Now the regeneration is only when they're unconscious because they're a transmutation troop, and the armor in BTS drops down to 0 when they take a wound. They don't lose any ballistic skill. And when you think about that full package, they are an expensive troop, particularly given that they have to be either your lieutenant or a chain of command, but the package that they bring is really useful. Now, some Tohaa lists will run 2 Taquiels, 1 lieutenant, 1 chain of command, both with Spitfires, both as kind of tip of the spear triad units, but I have found I really, really like, possibly this is for me the best piece in Tohaa, an unlinked Taquiel lieutenant with +1 lieutenant order. So we'll go to group 2 first and just have a look at how that works. So to start with, there are 2 irregular pieces in this group, Diplomatic Delegate and a Bounty Hunter on a bike with a submachine gun. These are both just great irregular pieces that you can put in any Tohaa list, and you will usually have enough command tokens to make work. The Delegate is a specialist and has Eraser, which is fantastic, and then the Bounty Hunter is just a warband. It's just a good warband that's fast that Tohaa otherwise doesn't really have because you want to link McCalls usually. It's got a Kowtow Specialist just to fill the group with some orders, and a Digger. Now this Digger you can change to a Chaxer for 10 points, which will give you 4 points to spend somewhere else. For example, you can use that to upgrade a Sukail in Combat Group 1 from a K1 to a Heavy Machine Gun. But this list needed to be able to play in Frostbite, and a Digger is a Heavy Infantry. It also just kind of is fine sometimes. Sometimes the Digger will go and do good things, and be a good deployment zone defender, it's fine. And then you have the Tackwheel Lieutenant Officer in this group. And what he means is that this group is not really a 3 regular, 2 irregular group. It is really more like a 5 regular, 2 irregular group, because the Tackwheel Lieutenant will almost always spend those orders, because he can use them to, if nothing else, lay smoke in zone of control on Whip 14. It's a clip smoke, so it's always useful, and the rest of your list can almost always benefit. Like, even if, for example, all you're going to do is move the Bounty Hunter forward and, I don't know, put it in suppressive fire or something, you can cover that advance just by spending your lieutenant orders to place down some smoke. That is super, super useful. If we think back to N3, for example, it was not uncommon to see Hakislam and Hassassin lists with a Moyib smoke grenade launcher lieutenant just to productively spend the LT order. That's been superseded these days by the Gulam NCO. But the idea of productively spending your lieutenant orders is more relevant in N4 than ever, because you're kind of capped at 15 troops. So I love this second combat group, and I love the Tackwheel lieutenant in it, and he always does something useful and is sometimes the star of the show. The rest of the list, Combat Group 1, is meat and potatoes. It is 3 triads and a Libertos. The Libertos is classic. And the 3 triads, you can actually mix and match a lot from the troops that are there. This is how they were played this game, but they're very modular. I've done different configurations based on what I needed to accomplish. The main thing is there are 3 McCalls, that's 1 in every combat group. There's 1 Kael'thar as a filler. There's 1 Sakiel Spitfire, which is just a cheap Spitfire 2 wound troop, which is there basically, that will stopgap firepower into whatever link team you think needs a 24-inch range-band gun. There are 2 Sukails with K1 weapons. 1 is a K1 combi rifle and 1 is a K1 sniper rifle. Now, the K1 sniper rifle, as I mentioned, can upgrade to a HMG. If you scrounge for points, you can potentially also upgrade it to a missile launcher. I like this loadout because sometimes you've just got to fight tags, and particularly in Tohaa, you've got this ferroware that is fantastic against light pieces with wounds, and you need something that fights heavy pieces with structure, tags, basically, and things like Sujans. So I rate K1 in Tohaa, but really you can flex that as you'd like. And then finally, there is Nima Satar with a Breaker Combi Rifle and a Tackwheel Chain of Command with a Spitfire. Now, the Tackwheel, we've just talked about why Tackwheels are awesome. This one it fills the role of a specialist in a triad, as well as a gun piece in a triad, as well as utility with the ferroware. And Nima is something that I'm trying out. The thing about this Nima profile is that 35 points is actually pretty affordable. And for that, you get an armor-piercing weapon that hits BTS, and a Panzerfaust, and 6-2 move, and stealth, and 3 wounds, and good defensive stats, and the best model in the faction to put a symbiote bomb on, and good enough close combat to make use of her stealth. And all of that together feels like it should kind of actually just be useful. And I have used her a number of times now, and she has mostly just performed. She's performed fine. The fact that she has 3 wounds in particular is often relevant. I run into some, even in those games where the dice have crapped out on her, the fact that she's had 3 wounds has kept her fighting, which has been really interesting, basically. So I'm going to continue to experiment with Nima. She was originally put in the list so that it could play Frostbite. And by the way, if you're playing this list in Frostbite, you make the Tackwheel Lieutenant your Snow Ops, so that not only does he have an additional irregular order, but then you have a lot of points for a Tohaa list you can put in the zone. But yeah, she's just performed well. So this is a list that I'm trying that makes no use of impersonators. It is built entirely around having good guns and lots of smoke and decent CC, and using smoke to deliver those guns and CC to points of the board where they will do the most damage to your opponent. So in that sense, it's uncomplicated, but execution is often tricky. And in this game, there are a number of things that sort of were interesting that I want to touch on, basically to make an interesting report. So this is the unfortunately bad picture of the map that we are playing on. It's a little blurry, but bear with me. So the scenario that we're playing for this is a modified version of the Armory that I'm testing out for an event that I want to run locally. And basically it's just the Armory with no armory. So there is a 12 by 12 square in the middle of the board with 2 panoplies. The scoring is identical to the Armory, but in the absence of Armory walls and Armory gates, contesting is much easier. I am mostly testing this because I don't want to source 4 different Armory buildings, and I don't want to have to, I want to solve the problem of running Armory in an event, meaning that every table has an Armory on it, which creates a dynamic that I would like. It's a bit inorganic. So I want to say, how does the Armory play if you take away the walls to the Armory? I have no particular conclusions as a result of this game. It was perfectly fine. It played well as a scenario. I scored a bunch of points. It seemed reasonable, but more testing definitely required. So I'm playing against Bakunin, and I have won the lieutenant role. I've chosen to set up second on the side that you can see, and that's strictly because this is the Armory. The Armory is a second turn scoring scenario, and especially, I think if you're playing the Armory classical with the full Armory room, the game can be advantageous to either player, in particular if the first player really is disciplined about the second mouse gets the cheese adage. So if you're going first in the Armory and it is a proper Armory scenario, I will never open the gates on the first turn. I will always make it my opponent's task on their first turn to spend those orders and open those gates and get into the objective room, so that they are at least wearing the cost. Because if I am going first and I've had orders stripped from me, and I open those doors myself, which takes skill rolls, and then I put models in the Armory for the strict purposes of contesting them, I'm giving up too much momentum. My opponent can almost always easily capitalize on that, whereas if I set up to make it annoying to go into the Armory, I put repeaters outside of it, for example, but I use all of the rest of my orders to attack my opponent, then they are left able to score uncontested, except by the fact that all of the doors are still closed. Now, this doesn't work in Panic Room, where the doors begin open, but in Armory I found it to be really successful. But in this game, there are no walls. So second turn is probably, my hypothesis is it is probably pure advantage, with the sole change that we're just playing on a normal table, so there are probably more defensive positions in the center of the map, more little nooks that you can put pieces into. We'll have to see. Anyway, so I've chosen to go second. My opponent is not willing to let me both deploy second, pick side, and go first. So they set up first on the table across from me. Now, there are some interesting things first that I want to note about their deployment. They deploy a Riot Girl core link, which is all Riot Girls of different profiles, including the dreaded Riot Girl with Tinbot -6, which Tinbots apply against comms attacks, and Ferroware is a comms attack. So if you are wondering how to deal with Tohaa Ferroware, if it's messing you up, a great place to start is a firewall. But they've got a Spitfire and a missile launcher and Avicenna. It's a big, strong Riot Girl core. There's one camouflage marker sitting inside the exclusion zone, some Morlocks, some Moderators, and some Flash Pulse bots and a War Core. So the first thing I want to sort of talk about here is the telegraphed nature of my opponent's reserve and how I figured out what it would be. Often, if you look at a list, it will be a little bit of a struggle to just gauge how many points are on the table. If you're particularly experienced, you can do it. And as you play more and more, you'll get more used to it. But, I mean, among other things, N4 has changed that litmus for all of us. And I don't get to play. I used to play probably like 3 games a week. I will usually play every week these days, which I'm super lucky to be able to do. But between COVID and everything else and work and other games, yeah, I play most weeks, but I don't have the same full-on muscle memory to just look at a board, look at a deployment, and know what's missing. So you can count how many troops there are visible in your opponent's deployment zone, and in this case I counted 14. But what I did otherwise is I compared it to lists I had seen previously, and I tried to figure out what was missing relative to a list I'd seen in the past. Now, I have not played against exactly this list before, ever, but I've played against a list that is similar. In particular, a list that uses a Moderator and Riot Girl core, and lots of zeros in the midfield, including Branda Castro, and a Lizard. Now, in this case, there was nothing in the midfield. It had all been replaced with Morlocks, and those points had been used to bulk out the Riot Girl core into a full heavy link, which meant that there was almost certainly still points remaining for a Lizard. So even though I didn't quite have it in me on a evening after work while I was recovering from coronavirus, to mentally count points in my head, and I wasn't willing to waste anyone's time opening up Army and plugging things in, compared to lists I'd seen previously, and kind of accounting for the changes that have been made, there was almost certainly a tag's worth of absence. So my deployment, when I deployed, prepared for a tag, and that meant null deployment. So I've got snipers, and I've got pieces that can go on Overwatch if needed, and of course it's Tohaa, so you have symbiomates, is that you've always got that kind of ablative defense if you need it. But I did not intend to contest a tag with any of the pieces that I had. It felt like too much of a waste of time. I have other ways that I can defend against a tag with this list. So we've basically just null deployed. I won't run you through all of the details, but you can see models scattered across the table there. They will form into triads. And there are 2 triads that will form up. And then there is a second triad with a sniper that will just form up over there. Now, the tack wheel lieutenant is nooked in here quite safely, and there's also a tack wheel officer there. And in particular, what I'm trying to do with that is extend those zones of control to cover as much of these lines into my deployment zone as possible. Now, the reason why I'm doing that, even though I suspect a Lizard attack, is something that will become more apparent in my second turn, so we'll get to that when we get to it. My opponent does indeed deploy a Lizard, and it comes down somewhere here, and so I deploy my Libertos just to try and stop it. Now, a Libertos is never in a million years, well, actually sometimes in a million years, but usually a Libertos will not stop a tag, but it's not too bad at delaying it and holding it up. That's all I expect from the Libertos, and it's an 8-point unit trying to fight a 75-point unit, but, fair cop. It will probably be able to accomplish that. So let's see what happens. My opponent has... The second combat group consists of 2 regular and 3 irregular, 1 regular and 4 irregular orders. I don't bother stripping from that. That's the Morlocks, and it's mostly just fuel to bring the Morlocks forward. So I strip orders from the first combat group, which has the Lizard in it. Now, the Morlocks do indeed, there's no Overwatch. This is the problem with putting up absolute no AROs. If I could have, I would, but I suspected there was something coming that would polish me off. So all of the Morlocks just basically run forward. And then, kind of cleverly, that 1 regular order is used to coordinate them forward as well. And so we end up with a situation where, with just the resources in Combat Group 2 plus 1 command token, we end up with 1 Morlock nestled in back here, and then the other 2 nestled pretty nicely in really hard to reach nooks in the space that is the Armory. So I don't have to deal with a warband attack on my first turn, but that's a very non-committal number of points put into non-committal models put into the scenario zone, and in locations where they can come out and attack me when it's their turn next turn with that small order pool very efficiently. But where I can't, or usually if I was playing anything but Tohaa, wouldn't be able to easily get to them. So I really quite like that. That's sort of a cool use of second combat group. Everything else, however, is spent on the Lizard, and it just barrels down here. Now, a couple of things happen that are worth pausing on in terms of the Lizard's attack. So the first thing is when it gets to this part, like it reaches my deployment zone, basically. So here we can see the Libertos and it's mine. Now, if you're paying attention, you'll be able to tell which of these is the mine and which is the Libertos, because only one of them has a prone marker next to it, which means, of course, it's the Libertos. So the lizard, after several movements, its first short skill carries it up to this wall here, so that it can see, if we place down its silhouette, it just has enough height to see the Libertos here, and moves into zone of control, or trigger area of the mine. That's the first short skill, so there is no point me arrowing with the Libertos. The mine detonates, and I elect not to arrow with the Libertos. Now, there's maybe an argument that if I felt like, say, if that was an AP mine or something, or I thought it realistically threatened the lizard, I might try and fork an arrow here, but it wasn't going to, and I didn't. So I just let the mine detonate. But something that was important was the placement of the mine. And I'll grab the line tool for this. So I placed the detonation of the mine so that it was something like that, not hitting the Libertos, but in that space there. And the reason why I did that was that, well, the lizard declared dodge and failed, and then spanged an armor. It took the armor roll and it passed, unsurprisingly. But that meant that it had to take a guts check. And because of how I had placed the template, if the lizard failed its guts, and it did, it had to guts out of that danger area, which forced it back this way, which moved it out of line of sight and line of fire of the Libertos, which meant that it could no longer discover shoot in a single order. So that was just a small optimization that ended up paying a reasonable dividend. And as it happens, I don't actually know if my opponent intended to discover shoot the Libertos, because he had extremely aggressive plans for this lizard. But that very small optimization meant, or could have meant under other circumstances, a more successful defense. The other thing that it did is that when it pushed that lizard back, it opened just enough space here that on a successful dodge, I might have dodged the lizard into CC. And that's one of the best things that I can look to do with the Libertos here, is it can't really threaten the lizard, and any time that it shoots the lizard, it's susceptible to just getting flamethrowered and dying. But if it ever gets into close combat, it's actually frustratingly difficult to scrape off the front of the lizard. It'll take many orders to do that, thanks to Dogged and its good ability to dodge and CC, etc. So all of this ultimately results in kind of not a great deal, but it does push the lizard back very slightly, and in the absence of ability to discover shoot, the lizard YOLOs forward, because he wants more. The mine is out of the way now, it's not wounded, and the lizard wants more than just a Libertos as its prize this turn. So this is the aggressive position it moves to, and we can actually see the silhouette marker it's moved from. It's covered all of this distance in a single short skill. Importantly, it doesn't have line of fire to this McCall. That's a McCall, by the way. I'm using my Sigma Trihedron here. Or the Sakiel Spitfire. But it can see the Sukhoi K1 combi rifle, forward observer, and it can see the Libertos. The Libertos is still in camouflage state at this point, and I have to decide how to ARO. We are inside 8 inches, measuring zone of control of the lizard when it finishes its first short skill, which means that it is 100% in flamethrower range of either or both of them. But I do have a Symbiomate on the Sukhoi. Sorry, I don't. I only have a Symbio Bomb. If I had a Symbiomate, this would be an easy choice, but I don't only have a Symbiomate. I only have a Symbio Bomb, which is not going to do me much use here. What I decide to do is reveal the Libertos and dodge, and shoot with the Sukhoi. So the shot with the Sukhoi is highly likely to do at least 1 wound to the lizard. I'm hitting on 16s with a K1 round. So that's kind of ideal. The reason why I do that and I dodge with the Libertos is that the Libertos is inside 3 inches of the lizard, which means that if it's not opposed in its dodge, it's got a good chance of crash tackling the thing. And if I can just do that, then I can potentially bug it down for a long time and allow, for example, this McCall to start making dodge moves and also get into close combat, which is going to be catastrophic if that happens. So what I'm trying to do here is force my opponent into a bad position where They want to be able to just flamethrower me. But if they flamethrower the Sukoil, then the Libertos is unopposed dodging on 16s into CC. And if they want to oppose the Libertos dodge into close combat, they have to use their heavy machine gun. And if they're firing their heavy machine gun, not only are they in bad range, but then the Sukoil's 2 dice on 16s is opposed by their potentially 3 or 4 dice on minus range, minus cover, minus mimetism. So 5s. Took me a second. Which is they're really likely to win the face-to-face roll. And that's exactly what happened. So this ended up being basically because of how aggressive my opponent played, they went for the prize, and I was able to puzzle out what I might do to stop them. If it was just the Libertos, I would dodge and I would get HMD'd 4 dice. Or my opponent could just keep moving. If the Libertos was engaging the Lizard alone and I dodged, the Lizard could just keep moving and I would never get into CC because it would easily move outside of 3. If my opponent was engaging the Sukoil Commando alone, then it would be an easy choice to wear the K1 shots, hope to only take maybe 1 wound, and flamethrower it back. But because of this combined fork, I was in a great position, basically. And although I think my opponent had always intended to be this aggressive, because he wanted to be aggressive, if I hadn't put him in a situation where he couldn't discover shoot the Libertos, then it at least would have been a choice that there would have been a choice that would have let them avoid this. So what happens after all of that foo-foo-ah? He decides he has to oppose the Libertos dodge, fires HMG and splits burst, and he wins neither face-to-face roll. So the Libertos dodges into close combat, and the Sukoil puts 2 wounds on the Lizard, which is ideal. Like, technically it could have gone better, because I could have crit, but that is just about the perfect outcome. He then decides that he has to fight his way free with the Lizard. The Lizard is the only piece he's got that is in position to make effective attacks, because the riot girls are all the way back in the deployment zone and they don't have anything to shoot. So he now has to just make CC attacks with the Lizard trying to kill the Libertos so that he can perform some kind of an attack with the remainder of his turn. So this is ideal, basically. What it does mean is that I have to decide how I'm going to resolve my arrows against the Lizard, because all of the same things can still see. Now, what I decided to do was shoot with the Sukoil and CC with the Libertos, on the grounds that the Sukoil needed 10s to hit firing into close combat. It was unlikely to hit the Libertos twice, and if it did hit Libertos twice, it was unlikely to kill it. So I had basically, as long as he committed to this, I had a really good chance of killing the Lizard before it could break free of close combat. I think, in retrospect, the better play was to declare either Forward Observer or Flash Pulse with the Sukoil, just because the Lizard was hugely unlikely to kill the Libertos in one shot. Lizards only have regular CC weapons, they don't have access to shock or DA, so it really, without a crit, it can't do 2 wounds to the Libertos. So what I ended up doing, by choosing to shoot, I ran the risk, actually significantly increased the risk that the Libertos might die in one order. I should have gone with a non-lethal round to start with, rather than risk everything for the kill immediately. And indeed, what happened is that Libertos actually won its face-to-face roll with the Lizard, and hooray for the Libertos. It didn't do any damage, but it survived, except that the Sukoil fired twice into close combat, missed twice, and I failed both my saves with the Libertos. Now, that was only like a 10% chance to happen, but I shouldn't have pulled that trigger until the Libertos was at least dogged. This would probably be different if my opponent was declaring dodge rather than CC with the Lizard. At that point, I would probably shoot. But anyway, it is what it is. The Lizard broke free of combat because I euthanized my own Libertos, but it's still in line of fire of a Sukoil and not really able to win a face-to-face roll. It pulls back and away to try and get some enfilade fire moving down my far right flank, and I shoot it with a Sukoil, and it flamethrowers me on the way out. I die all the way to dead, but the K1 rounds kill the Lizard. So, you know what? That is still a great defensive turn. I've lost 2 models, totaling 40 points, and my opponent has lost his tag, totaling about 70 something. So that's a great defensive turn, but a good example of like a very slight miscalculation and some good calculations that basically triaged a defense. So that ends my opponent's turn effectively. He remaneuvers his Riot Girl link a little bit, but there really aren't any assets left in the first combat group that can attack from the positions that they're in. There's an exclusion zone that whatever that camouflage marker is, it's a long way away, or he just sets up a defense, and in particular, he sets his Riot Girl missile launcher up to see the board. What this means is that we are in a position where I should be able to score some easy kills, take the central zone, score some points, and not expose myself to too much risk. So that's all I decide to do. Most of the work this turn gets done by tack wheel officers. So in the first combat group, the triad of Nima, tack wheel officer, and McCall leaves their current position and moves out over an underland. The tack wheel is prone and begins to crawl over this bridge, and the McCall and Nima move this way. And that's out of line of fire of the missile launcher, who is up here. There are flash pulse bots on picket duty as well, but I'm basically whatever. I don't have plans to engage with the McCall or Nima, so I just wear flash pulses. And what I'm looking to do here is get the tack wheel in position where its zone of control engages those two Morlocks, and I have to spend, it takes like 5 orders to kill the 2 of them, and I have to actually, I end up in a situation where one of them is just unconscious and I have to kill it because it has regeneration and +3 fizz. And so to solve that problem, I go to the second combat group, and the lieutenant activates and it lays down Eclipse, and actually lays it down at the level that it lays it down like at a high level so that it can climb down behind this this billboard and then move up here under smoke again, and it finishes off the 2. So between all of my orders and the 2 tack wheels, I get, I think, a Spitfire engagement, kills a flash pulse bot up here, and I kill the two Morlocks. And importantly, I kill the one that has regeneration all the way to dead, and that puts me with an absolute ton of points in the zone. And this is kind of how that Fort Kicker situation ends up. Now, this is actually a very slightly flawed position, because these 2 models, this tack wheel officer and this McCall, can be engaged from some stairs and a building that are over here. And that's not something that I want, because there's still a Riot Girl core link, and the last thing I want is to be easily engaged from my opponent's deployment zone by his biggest remaining gun. But I didn't quite see the line of fire, and I also spent too many orders trying to kill Morlocks. It's possible that I could have safely not done this. Morlocks don't have stealth, and they're advanced through tack wheel, zone of control. Like, this is a heavily overlapping zone of control mess here. This defense potentially could have held without needing to worry so much about killing the one that would regenerate. But I wanted to just be sure, be safe, basically. I think I also wasted at least 2, maybe 3 orders having Whip 15 Nima fail to press this panoply. But, you know, them's the breaks. Those things happen. So what does my opponent do with his turn? Well, he takes his Riot Girl Link team and he moves up that building where he can see the tack wheel and the McCall, and he takes face-to-face roll. Now, he aggressively engages both of them at once, and I get lucky here. The first face-to-face roll wounds, but doesn't kill the tack wheel officer, which is a thing that happens. But the second face-to-face roll, the tack wheel ties his engagement, and the McCall gets down smoke, which protects both of them. Because Eclipse smoke is awesome, but MSVs can't see through it. It's like the smoke of old. So what that means is that this lot is functionally immune to engagement, and any attempt my opponent makes to push up aggressively is going to be met by endgames, but it's also going to be met by mirror balls. And that's the second part of this list's defense that is interesting. So this is going to happen a couple of times over the remainder of the game. There's only one more big play that gets made. But the ability of tack wheels to mirror ball in zone of control in ARO is really, really useful. So, for example, let's say the Riot Girls, because there's smoke here now. Let's say the Riot Girls push up here and they've got boarding shotguns and close range weapons, and they're going to mess me up. they will have to give me multiple zone of control arrows, which either or both tack wheels can use to put Mirror Ball down here. Which means that now Nima is in Eclipse Smoke, so's the tack wheel, and none of the Riot Girls are great at close combat. And I can put Mirror Ball down there, and I can start dodging the McCall forward. And I'm almost totally safe. Now, if there's a single flamethrower or direct template weapon that can intuitive attack in that core link, it gets riskier because now they can just intuitive attack through the smoke. Which is why, for example, this is not necessarily an ideal tactic against a Sujan. But against the Riot Girls who only have those shotguns, it's fine. It works. It's a potentially ironclad defense. And my opponent, we talk that through. I kind of explain when he's talking about how he might attack. We just sort of workshop it. And so he just pulls back. Now, I think it probably would have been right for him to YOLO forward anyway, because he was behind at this point. I'd already scored one round in the Armory, and a second round was basically going to be an insurmountable advantage. But he didn't want to, and kind of reasonably, right? He was at this point basically hoping that I would make a mistake. And his logic is that if he parks his entire Link team in the Armory, which is this kind of area here, you can kind of eyeball it off of where the panoplies are, then I'm just going to eat all of it with McCalls and Nima, because he can't outfight me in close combat. And that's fair enough. But I have no intention of making that kind of a mistake. So he pulls his Riot Girl Link all the way back, and he sets it up in the same Overwatch position. So I can't really, Attack Whale Spitfire is BS13 Burst 5. If I engage a Riot Girl missile launcher, well, it's inside 24 inches. She doesn't have a range bonus. She's also on 13s. Riot Girl missile launcher, sorry. But I've got no wounds left. I don't have an appetite for that fight, basically. But I've got all of these points already in the zone. My opponent has to come to me. All I need to do is make the defense a surer thing. And so I just use the small number of orders that I have to finally press this fucking panoply. The lieutenant does the same thing in his combat group too. None of them get anything that's particularly interesting. And I end up with this tack wheel officer moving prone up to there, and this McCall moving up to there. Which means that any subsequent attack that does the same thing, the mirror ball can go down and just 100% block the path with the McCall, forcing any attack on my tack wheel to have to CC a McCall beforehand. And there's nothing in my opponent's list that can do that. So I take this, basically, I make safe the city, and then I have some orders spare. And I notice an interesting fire lane. So if we go back to this deployment zone picture, there's a war core over here, and there's a sniper over here. I have to move the sniper to there to take the face-to-face roll. But when I do, and we measure that, it's about 48 inches. And my opponent's Riot Girl is here. Now I can't see the Riot Girl from this rooftop, but I can get down. So I do. And this blurry-ass picture is the eventual line of fire that we have. I have to go all the way to the back of the table edge and break cover to see this Riot Girl in the distance here. But this face-to-face roll is another one that is like 47 inches. Now, unfortunately, that just means that it's 3 dice 13s to 2 dice 13s, because I haven't been able to claim cover. But that's not a bad face-to-face roll against a core Link team. And the reason why, if this was like, say, a Tanko missile launcher, it would be on 10s for the Tanko, because my mimetism would work. But it's a Riot Girl, so it has MSV1. But this is a long-ass face-to-face roll, a long-ass gunfight, and it feels worth taking, because I have the orders, I'm comfortable with the midfield position. And so we have this engagement, and it's inconclusive for a round of shooting. And I decide at that point that that's ideal. Like, I don't need to do any more. The lieutenant, you can actually also see in this picture, has like wombled across and killed the last Morlock with endgame. Good for him. He's a champ. Always has something useful. But I just leave this Sukwale here. And so you can see another shot of like just how long this line is. I just leave the Sukwale there. Ostensibly, in active turn, my odds are better, but I don't really have a lot more orders to spend at this point. And it is not really any less of a problem for my opponent in his active turn. In fact, it's kind of worse, because now he has to spend orders to assume the risk, and I still have a Symbiomate. And in fact, that's basically what ends up blowing up in his poor face. The Link team is still standing here, and it has to at this point. I haven't made the mistake that he hoped I would. The Link team has to decamp and move into the midfield, which means the Riot Girl has to take a face-to-face roll against the Sukwale. And this time, she doesn't get lucky, and I do. And she goes unconscious. And Avicenna picks her back up again. And this is another face-to-face roll, I win again, and she goes unconscious. And he has no more command tokens to reform the Link. So the poor last turn of Bakunin is basically an unlinked shotgun Riot Girl running forward, and then the exact thing happens that I telegraphed in the previous turn, where just Mirror Ball completely stymies the attack. And she ends up in a situation where literally she has to, the only way to progress and to get kills that she would need to hold down this fort is to literally run into close combat with McCall in smoke. And 2 orders later, she's dead, and I have more panoplies, and I'm securing the HVT, and I have scored every round of the Armory, including the last. So the actual points, there's a bit of bad luck on my opponent's part. Ultimately, the game came down to a couple of like flux points, or of fulcrums almost. But I found them really interesting. And, you know, the list in this particular instance was carried by Tack Wheels. I know in my future there is a game against Bakunin where they have 2 or 3 Uberfell Commando who have structure and pupniks, and none of this works, and they are close combat monsters, and they have climbing plus, and I die. That is the penalty for the hubris in this particular case. So none of it is a truly airtight defense, as much as it would be cool as a Tohaa player for that to be the case. But there are a lot of interesting tools on display, and there were some like minor decisions on optimizations that I thought might be useful. So yeah, I salvaged what pictures I could from my phone, chucked it up into this battle report, and I hope you enjoyed it. Not sure what's coming up next. There is a Loss of Lieutenant challenge out currently for the month of February to do close combat, which I'm not actually sure how I build the list that does more close combat than I usually do. Close combat is a very like, it's the very best tool for those circumstances where it's the very best tool. Forcing close combat, actually like engaging with a challenge to do lots of close combat is tricky. Maybe Yuching? I haven't featured a Yuching video in some time on the channel playing as. I've kind of bounced off of them this edition. But monks are super good, so then maybe there's something stabbing people with monks, that being the only warband that kept stealth, bless them. So maybe there's something in that, but we will see. As always, comments super welcome. Hope you enjoy this, and stay tuned for the next one.